My why, I've already said it, but I'll say it again, is to build a family that maintains its identity as a force for good for generations. In other words, the Knowltons are a people who add value to their community. And I want that to be true, not just while I'm alive, but for generations.
Welcome to the Real Freedom Show, where we inspire you to pursue your passion to gain time and financial freedom through opportunities in real estate. I'm your host, Mike Swenson. Let's get some real freedom together. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Real Freedom, Real Estate Leverage Freedom, where we talk about different ways that people can build time and financial freedom through opportunities in real estate. I'm your host, Mike Swenson. If you want to get started on your real estate investing journey, check out our website, freedomthroughrealestate.com. We have lots of great information on there, articles with the goal to inspire you guys to pursue and take action on something inside of real estate. Today's guest on our show, I'm really excited to share. We have John Knowlton here, gonna get us to think a little bit bigger and a little bit more long-term about your future. So John actually built $1 billion business, sold it, walked away at the age of 51, took a year off in COVID, traveling around in an RV, and really, gained some additional perspective. And so you are the author of the book, Thinking for Success, 52 Stories That Upgrade Your Thinking to Boost Productivity, Problem Solving, and Relationships. And really, you're about focusing on thinking about your future and building wealth and getting your family involved, putting together mission, vision, value statements, and inspiring people to think bigger than that. And that having enough money is not necessarily the finish line, but there's so much more that you can do with it. So, John, I'm excited to have you on to be able to get us to think differently and to think bigger about our purpose and what we're doing here. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, Mike, it's a real pleasure. And it's really my hope that this conversation will be a blessing to the listeners and viewers, and that people can get a vision for something bigger than just hitting 100% complete on their financial plan. For 20 some years, I worked as a financial planner, and the software that most of the industry uses, analyzes, is your goal complete? In other words, do you have enough money to hit your retirement goal? And that's 100%. And it never goes to 110 or 120. Like 100 is the top. Like you've got enough. And my challenge with that was I was always frustrated with the software. And what I've realized is, you know what? My goal is to build a family that lasts as an entity, as a force for good for multiple generations. And hitting 100% for me and my wife's spending needs, that's not my goal. My goal is a whole lot bigger than that.
I think about that as well. I know just from talking with people that help with finances and management. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've kind of heard, the general thought is, you build that nest egg and then you focus on, okay, I take 4% every year until it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then, what happens if you live longer, right? People are living longer. There's improvements to health. And so you don't want to outlive your money. And so, to your point, if somebody is like, hey, I got the 100% and then you live longer, you're kind of stuck. And for me, what I love about investing in things like real estate is, over time, real estate can continue to appreciate. It can continue to go up in value. And if you have your assets in something that's producing that consistent cash flow, your income's not going to necessarily go down, or it's less likely to go down. And then you don't have to be as worried about, am I going to outlive all that savings that I built? But to your point, there's so much more out there. And for me, it's about changing my family tree, being able to do something for my kids, however involved or not involved they want to be, but it's building something that can last beyond when my wife and I pass away. So excited to hear what you have to share on that.
Mike, that's really interesting. I've been studying families that last for multiple generations. And one of the things that is true about most of these families is they own illiquid assets. In other words, they own factories and businesses and companies and real estate that isn't easy to liquidate, or you can't just call the stockbroker and say, send me 100 grand, and then it's just frittered away and dissipated. But there's an asset or a portfolio of assets that are illiquid and have enduring value. Now, I still own plenty of stocks. Don't worry. It's a good driver, but the real estate and the longer term type assets are in alignment if you have a goal of building a family that lasts longer than just you and your spouse.
Hmm.
Just a couple of examples. There's a family called the Grosvenor family, and their G1, if you will, their first generation that they trace back to, came to England in 1066 with William the Conqueror. That's 900 and what 70 years ago or something, 60 years ago. And he was granted a little bit of land on the north side of the Thames River, which is now a big portion of that land is occupied by the city of London, which is their Wall Street. It's the financial district. So it's like owning Manhattan as your little family estate. So
Hmm.
just a really interesting, that's a long family.
I'm curious to hear, just to kind of start here and set the stage. So talk about building up your business and kind of the sale piece, and then thinking about what you're working on today, the whys behind it and the hows, just to get people thinking a little bit differently about how they're approaching building wealth and their goals in business.
Sure. So I started out as a financial planner or financial advisor in the 90s. And I mean, it was before we had computers on the desk. I mean, it was a phone book and a phone was like the office equipment. It was smile and dial, interrupt people at dinner and try to get them to talk about financial planning or reducing their taxes or whatever. And turned that into a practice, not just a sales call, but a practice, got some staff, transitioned the business model from transactional to advice based, where you collect fees for advice rather than commissions for transactions. And did my first deal where I bought out a retiring advisor in 2004 and realized, oh, you can get clients one at a time or you can buy them in chunks. And I liked the buying them in chunks piece. And so spent a decade or so figuring out how to do that, how to market to financial advisors, how to talk to them, how to get them earn their trust and get them to consider selling their business to us. And so in 2015, we were managing about $125 million, small little team in an office, and we set a goal of being at $1 billion. And so kept pursuing our M&A, mergers and acquisitions strategy. And we had a key merger in 2018 with another firm. So we had the mergers and acquisition expertise. The other firm, the partner firm, had a really great client service experience and model and tools to drive that, as well as really good investment management capabilities. And so we merged as a cashless merger so that the M&A expertise now had a great platform to pop deals into. And
Hmm.
over the next few years, we 10x'd that thing. So we went from 125 million in 2015 to $1.25 billion in 2020. That was in 5 years. Yeah, we 10x'd in 5 years, and that's a lot of growth, and it takes a lot of work. And so in 2020, we had hit my business goal of being at $1 billion, and one of my adopted kids was had been living in a residential treatment facility and was ready to come home. And my wife said, "Hey, I'm going to need some help reintegrating this child into the family." And so our operating agreement contemplated the entry and exit of partners. And so I was the first one to exercise the option to sell. And the rest of the team bought me out and took a year off, as you said in the introduction. And so, any case, didn't really need to work for money.
Hmm.
My 100% was hit, if you will, on my financial needs analysis, but I can't just sit around, and so I've been cranking ever since.
You had mentioned about getting your family involved and participating. Because I know a lot of people, they might run a business or own a business, and the goal is, hey, I'm going to have my kids run that when I die. And for a lot of people, like it's not something they're interested in. And
Mm.
so, like I had a college roommate where as soon as he graduated college, he took over the family business and he runs it. And I know for me, I've always said, the idea of, I'd kind of said it, my kids, it's like they can participate if they want. They don't have to, but it's going to be something that's a choice for them if they want to in the future. And if not, no worries. We're going to encourage them to do what they want to do. But for you, it's so much more than that, like having your family involved in participating in their future and putting together a mission, vision, values, and being an entity that can accomplish so much more. I'd love to kind of dive into that side of it and talk about the why behind that for you and kind of what drove that conversation. And then we can kind of talk about the fruit from that.
Yeah, sure. That's a wonderful place to start. So I just want to make a quick comment. I like to distinguish wages for work versus profits for ownership. And so it's possible to be an owner of a business but not work in it. It's
Hmm.
possible to work in a business and not own it, or you could do both. And I think it's important to align compensation, your wages for work, and you can have a compensation philosophy about that. Are we an entry level employer? Are we a middle of the pack? Or are we above the average? You can set your parameters around that. But if somebody's working in the business, even if they're your kid, I think they should be paid. And then
Hmm.
if they're an owner, then there's also an element of, there's some rewards for owning things. So I just think that's an important distinction. I was talking to a guy in Europe recently who said that in the tradition in Europe is you work for the family business for minimum wage as your contribution to the family business, which what do you know? People are really resentful about this. It shouldn't be a
Hmm.
surprise. It wasn't to me. So, any case,
Hmm.
but to your question about why. So Simon Sinek in his book Start with Why told us to start with why. In other words, figure out why are we doing what we're doing. And so my why, I've already said it, but I'll say it again, is to build a family that maintains its identity as a force for good for generations. In other words, the Knowltons are a people who add value to their community. And I want that to be true, not just while I'm alive, but for generations.
Hmm.
So that's the why. The what, so I'll come back to the how, which is in the middle. Why is force for good for generations. The what is stewardship of our family resources, our family wealth. And then the how is the unique piece that I'm bringing to this, I believe is unique. And it's what I call shared governance. So if you think about the standard estate planning model, most people think of, hey, this is mom and dad's money. We're going to do with it what we want. We'll take a cruise if we want. We'll give it away if we want. We'll do whatever we want with it. And then when we die, we'll split up what's left, and the
Hmm.
kids get their money. Well, there's a few things that are a challenge to me about that. The first is I plan to live a long time and be real old when I die. So
Hmm.
my kids wouldn't get access to the funds until it was probably after they could really benefit from it. They'll probably
Hmm.
have already been quite established in their careers or maybe retired. Secondly, there's a real risk of dissipation. In other words, of those assets just kind of going poof. There's a proverb in America that some people have heard called shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea is the first generation builds some wealth, the second generation spends it, the third one loses it, and then you're back to manual labor again, just starting from scratch. Lots of cultures have a version of that. In China, it's rice paddy to rice paddy. In Ireland, it's potato patch to potato patch, etc. And so that idea of just dumping the money on your kids after you're dead, first of all, doesn't prepare them for managing a big chunk of money if it's a big chunk. Um, if they have not been used to, managing millions of dollars, they will have no idea what to do. And secondly, it it's a challenge in that they might not have not just the mechanical or the intellectual skills, but they might not have learned how to integrate the values that produce such wealth. So values of hard work, of service, of putting others before yourself. Those are the characteristics of people who build wealth, is that we seek to add value. And the way God built the world is when you add value, you receive value in return. And so lots of estate planning in the traditional estate planning model, they'll build trusts and wills with these, what they call dead hand control or control from the grave. In other words, they write very restrictive language about what the beneficiaries have to do in order to receive the benefits. But I want to flip that around and start to teach my kids while I'm alive how to manage money. How do I think about giving money away? How do I think about philanthropy? How do we how do we choose our investments and set our investment policy statements up and all that. So shared governance is the how we're going to build this family that lasts and maintains its identity as a force for good for generations.
That's great. I'd love to kind of hear your wife and kind of your kids take through this process because it's one thing where it's, hey, I'm John here, I'm dad, and I'm kind of saying, here's what I want to have happen, kids. And as we know, kids sometimes they're excited about the things we talk about, sometimes they could care less about the things that we talk about. So maybe talk a little bit about getting their buy-in and their input on something like this. Just curious to hear their reactions and how that's kind of grown over these last couple years.
Yeah, it's a fun story. It's funny to me because my kids tease me mercilessly. And a couple years ago, I warned them I wanted to have a family meeting about important matters, money stuff. And I gave them 2 or 3 months notice, so I didn't want to spring it on them. We put it in the calendar over Christmas time and stuff. And my oldest daughter, she says to my wife, "Is there going to be a PowerPoint?" And Julie said, you know him, of course, you know. So
Yep.
what we did, and Julie and I worked on this together,
How
is
old was she at the time, your oldest?
26 or 7, something
Okay.
like that. Yeah, she's
Yep.
28 now. We worked on telling the story of our marriage, sort of how faith and finances have been integrated over the last 25 years. We've always tithed on every dollar we've made. There were a number of times when we felt directed by God to do something that didn't make financial sense, but then there was a whatever the outcome was on that. Uh, Often it was very lucrative to do what God told us to do. In one case, we were in deep trouble, and someone else didn't know that we were in trouble, but felt prompted to just give Julie some money when she didn't know how she was going to buy diapers, those kinds of stories. And so we documented all of that, and we've told that story to our kids. And then I went to, here's our current situation. I retired. Here's how much money we have invested. Here's the property we own. Here's the bank accounts. I've charted my income for the last 28 years. Here's John's income. And, just laid it all out there, open the kimono all the way. We'd like to invite you into shared governance. And I explained the traditional estate planning model, just like I did with you a minute ago, and essentially invited them to join the work of building this family and learning how to manage money and learning to work together to build this family legacy. I have 4 children. The oldest two said yes. The youngest two, I don't think are quite ready for it. It feels pretty adult,
Hmm.
and maybe we're rushing it a little bit. So that's okay. They've given me permission to ask them once a year if they want to join the work. And then
Hmm.
I'm happy with that. That's cool.
Yeah. And how old are the younger two?
Oh, 20 and 17.
Okay.
So I was willing to have them on board, but yeah, when they're ready.
I've thought a lot, and we've had some guests on too, that have talked about, sharing with your kids about money, having those types of conversations and, how to approach it. And so everybody does it differently, but I know for me, I wanted to introduce those types of conversations or even just, opportunities working in the business with us because, growing up, both of my parents were W-2 employees. So I didn't have those opportunities. And so just wanting to slowly introduce them. But to the point we've kind of talked about, yeah, you want it to be their choice and not something that they have to do because I just think you see it in the media and movies and whatever where it's like forcing the kids to do the things they don't want to do because dad wants them to and it's like just because you want that doesn't mean they want that for themselves. But I also like the idea of all your kids working together. They're going to have different perspectives, they're going to have different ideas, and it's stewardship of something long term. And so when I had you reach out, it was, that's the part that was kind of intriguing to me to hear about is, how that can happen and getting the kids on board and building something that's going to last.
I've got a really cool recent example of how they engaged in decision making with us. So as soon as they said yes, they'd like to participate in this work, we scheduled a series of meetings, and our board meetings are on Saturday mornings in the Eastern time zone from 10:30 to 11:45, we found out that an hour and 15 minutes is our sweet spot. And one of my kids lives on the West Coast, and so we that's 7:30 in the morning for him. So that's our time for board meetings. And we've gone through this process of identifying and documenting our family's mission. What are we doing here? And our vision. If we're successful at our mission, how will the world be different? And our values. And our values include two that are sort of the opposite of the same coin. One is self-sufficiency. In other words, we're responsible for supporting ourselves. But the other one that's related to it is support. We will support each other when it's necessary.
Hmm.
And so one of my kids got in trouble, and I was kind of on the horns of a dilemma. Do I rush in and help the kid, or do I hang back and allow consequences to happen? It was that thing where you're trying to balance, do I save them or do I let them have the outcome that is the result of their choices? And I realized I have a board I can call.
Hmm.
And so I called an emergency meeting, and we had two of our kids and a fiance on the call, and I laid out the situation, and I got their wisdom and insight, and it was so helpful, Mike, to hear from their perspective, wrestling through those consequences versus helping and saving and whatever. And it was super helpful for me to hear from them and their perspectives. They're wise people. I didn't know they were as smart as they are
Hmm.
until I let them talk. And then secondly, whatever the decision was that we would take, there's no opportunity for resentment because they helped make the decision. So some families, there's one kid that needs more help or is has whatever their personal issues are. And so they either get more attention or they get more time or they get more money or whatever. And you hear these stories of that really building up some resentment amongst the other siblings. I think this is a way to get rid of the whole resentment piece because it's not mom and dad sort of monolithically making decisions, but hey, let's decide together. Here's the resource, here's the need, what's the appropriate response? Together we'll
Mhm.
decide. It really
Mhm.
is a beautiful thing.
Now, thinking about, where your kids are at in life right now, obviously they're a little bit older in terms, starting their own journeys and, kind of your youngest being 17. For people that have, so like as an example, my kids are, 14, 11, and 9 or 8, excuse me. Thinking about something like that where they are younger, not as well developed, emotionally and in terms of maturity and thinking about that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's ways where you can get them excited and talk about those types of things. But maybe what are some thoughts that you have for, folks that have younger kids or they're not quite to the point where, they're entering the adulthood stage?
Yeah, of course, we want to be age appropriate in the ways that we approach our kids and whatever they're ready for. I have a couple of practical suggestions, and the first one is to have a regular meal together and have intentional conversation. Sometimes we come home from work and say, "Hey, what's for dinner?" But that's the wrong question. To me, the important question is, what is dinner for? In other words, what is the purpose? And yes, we need some calories and nutrients, but the real purpose, or I suggest that we transform the purpose of the meal together, is relationship building and values transmission. And so we ask the four questions every time, every dinner. And it's actually only two that you have to remember. How was your day? What do you need? So if you have a husband and a wife or, two spouses, they can each ask that. There's four questions. And then you can ask the kids. Here's what's happening. The kids are watching their parents talk to each other, hearing about their day. How was your day? You're hearing, how did I navigate the day? I had a troublesome conversation with an employee. I'm going to talk about that. I had a great meeting with a prospect, and I think we're going to do some work together. And they get to hear about that. So your kids are much more as caught than is taught, right? So they're catching. How does dad, how does mom make their way in the world? And then they're seeing that they're offering to help each other and they're willing to provide value. What do you need tonight from me? What do you need from me? How can I help you? Those are critical things. That is an example of what my friend Roger Whitney calls little conversations. So, we have there's all kinds of emotionally charged topics, money, sex, religion, politics, right? All these kinds of things. And sometimes we wait until something's urgent and critical. And then we have this big, huge, scary conversation. But if we can get in the habit of having regular little conversations, we sort of let the air out of the balloon slowly instead of, popping it and having a big explosion. So the mealtime is a great time to start imparting your values and how you make your way in the world. And then I really think it's important to give kids some money that they're responsible for. And you could call it an allowance or a stipend or their whatever, however you want to call it. But they should probably get some guidance on, do they tithe on it? Do they give money away? Do they save it? Do they spend it? And, letting them make decisions with $10 or $20. If you can do that well, then maybe they get 50 or 100, those kinds of things. And so that they're learning, they're getting values through the little conversations, and they're getting practice with their own money that they get to steward. And when they blow it all on something dumb and they don't get any more money until next month, they might cry, but you're going to make sure they have food, and right, the consequences are pretty small, although maybe emotionally challenging for them.
Now, talk a little bit about your process for writing a book. I always like to ask authors that are putting together books, like kind of what's the seed? How did that come together? And then, kind of how does the distribution piece work? Because it's a large undertaking to do that. And so I just kind of like to hear the backstory of, how that works and how you put that together and kind of why you put it together.
Yeah, thank you. My book is called Thinking for Success, and it's 52 stories. So there's 52 short chapters in this book. I didn't set out to write this book, Mike. It was really a function of desperation, because as I was leading teams of people, they would keep coming to me with questions or problems, and I would give them an answer. And then it didn't take me long to realize I'm tired of being the guy that gives them all the answers. So I started to teach them principles or theories. And then I realized they didn't always know how to apply the theory to the problem. And then I stumbled on telling a story in a staff meeting. And then people would engage with that and start to say, hey, my uncle did something like that, or whatever the case might be. And I've subsequently learned that smart people say stories are cognitively privileged. In other words, they get priority in our brains much more than theories. And so I began to tell stories intentionally in staff meetings. Then we would talk about it and sort of come up with our conclusion. What's our takeaway from this story? And people began to apply the stories, use those as guides to their thinking and their behavior. And then I said, geez, these are kind of working good. I better write them down or I'm going to forget them. And then at some point I realized, 10 years into this, realized I had 40 stories and said, geez, if I had 52, that'd be one a week for a year, et cetera. So I kept writing them and got to something like 70. And then 2 years ago said, all right, it's time to land this plane. Let's turn this into a book. And I hired an editor to trim it down and, clean it up. And then we decided to proceed, and I hired a designer to build a really beautiful cover of the book. And so it just launched on January 6th of 2026. And we've done a book launch party, and we sold all the books out of the Barnes & Noble in our town. And, it was really fun.
Are you looking to get started or scale in real estate investing but don't know your next step? Are you overwhelmed thinking about finding deals, analyzing deals, doing due diligence, and managing properties on top of it? Go ahead and push the easy button and invest with us. Real estate investing is what we do full time. We've done dozens of deals with hundreds of doors. We have the knowledge and experience to handpick the best deals that most investors can't find. We've got large off-market deals all the time where you can hopefully find returns and economies of scale that you just can't find on your own. The best thing is it's 100% passive to you for less capital than you put down trying to acquire a property on your own. Don't let this year go by where you don't make the leap, add to your portfolio, or you just sit in analysis by paralysis. To find out more, visit freedomthroughrealestate.com and click on Invest. You can book a call and learn more there. So get to scaling your portfolio now with us by your side. That's freedomthroughrealestate.com and click on Invest. Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, it's cool that books are great because it plants a seed in you of something to be able to share with others. And in a case like this, yeah, there's a lot of great life lessons and applicable things that they can learn. And so I just love to hear people's stories of kind of how that comes up, because I know it's not an easy feat to do. And so, yeah, it sounds like for you over time, it was just germinating there and growing. And I love it.
The hard part, Mike, is when you open the first email back from your editors and see this Red Sea, how they've just murdered all your favorite children that, were your babies in this story. And they're just like, that was a terrible paragraph and whatever. So at first I started to edit the editors, and then I was like, wait a second, I'm paying them. Accept changes. Yep. It was a good lesson for me.
So kind of tell folks here, what you're doing today and what you're working on, and then how can folks get a hold of you?
Mike, my life is full, I'll tell you. So I'll answer the last question first. So the book is called Thinking for Success. So thinkingforsuccess.com. And then the company that my wife and I have built that creates content, including this book, is called AbundantThoughtRevolution.com. And so we're on the socials and YouTube, and you can go to that website as well. What I'm doing these days, I've been serving Christian CEOs as a C12 leader. In other words, I would lead a monthly business retreat, day-long business retreat for two different groups in Elkhart, Indiana, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. That my season there is wrapping up. I'm going to go to my church as chief of staff to help build systems, and we're going to be managing a leadership succession plan over the next few years, and so I'll kind of be behind the scenes, making sure everything is in place for that. I do a lot of writing. I have 3 different writing blocks each week, one on shared governance and 2 on some spiritual work that I'm doing. I do real estate as well. So my son in Oregon is a general contractor. And so the family buys real estate, residential real estate that has opportunity for value add. And then he manages those projects and performs some of the work himself. And then we sell them and split the profits. And then I do long-term rental real estate here in my market. And I have a few other things. People ask me to help them sell their businesses, and so I've done a lot of deals, and so I help people through that process. And I see people seem to call me when their organizations are tense or things aren't working smooth. Hey, I've got 9 people all mad at each other. Will you come? Okay, sure. Happy to jump into that.
Sounds like a great opportunities there.
Yeah. Well, it can't get much worse, right? So it's like it's like being a pathologist. If you're a doctor, what's the worst going to happen? The guy's going to wake up and come back to life, So you go into a mess, and it's not going to get much worse.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on and sharing kind of your background and your story and what's been put on your heart to share with others. And so thank you so much for sharing that with people. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing, and excited to see where this continue to grow in the future.
I love it, Mike, and I just hope everybody is able to find a financial and time freedom so that you can do what you were really designed to do. That's success, is walking more and more fully into the purpose for which you were created.